Imagine losing everything you built over 25 years in a single 10-minute meeting. Imagine walking out of an office building for the last time, holding a cardboard box, while coworkers you trained now avoid eye contact with you in the parking lot. Imagine applying to 200 jobs over 8 months and hearing nothing back, not even a rejection. That was my life at 49 years old. My name is Michael Turner. I was an IT manager in Dallas, Texas, for over 2 decades, divorced, no kids, no safety net except a shrinking savings account. When the company announced restructuring, I told myself it wouldn't touch me. I was wrong. Then I did something nobody expected. I sold almost everything I owned and moved to the Philippines. Before we continue, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and leave a comment below telling us which country you're watching from. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this really started. For 25 years, my identity was my job title. I was the guy who fixed things, who stayed late, who trained the new hires, who got the panicked phone calls at midnight when the servers went down. I had a nice house in a quiet Dallas suburb, a decent 401k, and a routine so predictable I could do it half asleep. Up at 6, coffee, gym twice a week if I was being honest with myself. Office by 8, home by 7, repeat. My marriage had ended 6 years earlier. No dramatic fight, no affair, no single moment I could point to and say, that's when it broke. Just 2 people who slowly stopped being partners and started being roommates who shared a mortgage. We didn't have kids, so the divorce was clean, at least on paper. What it left behind wasn't clean at all. It left behind quiet. A house that echoed in a way it never had before. A calendar with nothing written on the weekends. A refrigerator with condiments and not much else. Work filled that silence, and for a long time, I let it. I told myself I didn't need anything else. Not a wife, not kids, not hobbies beyond the occasional round of golf with 2 other guys from the office who were also somewhere between divorced and remarried. I had my job. That was enough. I actually believe that. I want to be honest about something most people my age don't like admitting out loud. I liked being needed. When someone in the office had a problem, I was the one they came to. That feeling, being useful, being the guy with the answers, became the thing that got me out of bed some mornings more than anything else in my personal life did. So, when they took that away from me, they didn't just take a paycheck. They took the only thing I still felt good at. There's a particular comfort in being an expert at something, even something as unglamorous as enterprise IT infrastructure. I knew that building. I knew which server room ran hot in the summer, which department always broke their passwords, which VP would call me directly, instead of going through the help desk, because he trusted me more than the process. 25 years builds a kind of quiet authority you don't notice until it's gone. Looking back now, I can see how much of my self-worth had quietly relocated into that badge that let me into the building, that title on my email signature, that sense of being essential. I didn't build much of a life outside those walls, and for a long time, I didn't think I needed to. The job was steady. The paycheck was steady. I assumed, the way you assume the sun will rise, that this would simply continue until I decided to retire on my own terms, not anyone else's. It was a Tuesday morning in March. I remember it was raining, one of those slow Texas rains that doesn't feel urgent but soaks everything anyway. HR sent a calendar invite titled, All Hands Company Update, for 9 a.m. I didn't think much of it. We'd had a dozen of those over the years. New benefits packages, new software rollouts, the usual corporate noise. This one was different. The CEO spoke for maybe 4 minutes. Words like streamlining, redundancies, and difficult decisions got thrown around in a tone that was rehearsed to sound compassionate. Then we were told that HR would be reaching out individually to affected employees over the next few hours. I sat at my desk after that call, staring at my monitor, running through a mental list of who might be at risk. I thought about the 2 junior guys I'd hired the year before. I thought about a woman in accounting who'd just bought her first house. I never once, not seriously, put my own name on that list. 25 years felt like armor. I was wrong about that too. At 11:20 a.m., my phone rang. It was Denise from HR, someone I'd had lunch with maybe a dozen times over the years. Her voice was careful, professional, kind even, and it didn't matter one bit. 22 people were let go that same day, including me. 25 years reduced to a 15-minute call and a box to pack. The severance was decent by most standards. 12 weeks of pay, continuation of health insurance for 3 months if I paid my portion. It felt like a lot of money the day I got the letter. It felt like nothing 3 months later. I remember driving home that day with the radio off. No podcast, no phone call to anyone. Just silence, and this strange, numb feeling like I was watching my own life happen to someone else. I didn't cry, I didn't call anyone. I just sat in my driveway for almost 20 minutes before I could make myself walk inside. That first night, I did what I imagine a lot of people do. I made a list, contacts to reach out to, resume updates needed, a rough budget of how long my severance and savings could stretch. On paper, it looked manageable. 12 weeks of pay, a few months of insurance, a healthy 401k. I told myself I wouldn't touch except as an absolute last resort. I went to bed that night almost convinced this was a temporary detour, not a derailment. The job search started with confidence, maybe even arrogance if I'm honest. I had 2 decades of experience. I had certifications. I had a resume that, on paper, looked like exactly what any IT department would want. Surely something would come through in a month. Maybe 2, worst case. I updated my LinkedIn. I reached out to old contacts. I applied to companies across Dallas, then across Texas, then anywhere that would take a remote application. The first month, I got 3 phone screens. Encouraging, I thought. This is just how it works. You go through some early rejections before you land the right one. Then a month became 3 months. 3 became 6. And somewhere in there, I discovered something nobody warns you about when you're climbing the ladder in your 30s and 40s. After 45, especially in tech, companies quietly stop calling back. Nobody ever said the words, "You're too old," to my face. Nobody would be that reckless in this day and age. But I felt those words in every "we've decided to move forward with other candidates" email. I felt it in the interviews that went great right up until the interviewer's eyes flicked to my graduation year on the resume. I felt it when a hiring manager who couldn't have been more than 32 asked me with genuine confusion whether I'd be comfortable taking direction from someone younger. I started doing something I'm not proud of. I took my graduation year off my resume. I removed my oldest jobs, even though they were some of my strongest experience, just so the resume wouldn't scream, "This man remembers dial-up internet." It didn't help much. The calls still slowed down. The silence still grew. I remember one interview in particular, maybe 5 months into the search, for a systems manager role at a mid-sized logistics company. It went well for 45 minutes. The interviewer, a friendly enough guy named Chris, seemed genuinely impressed by my background. Then, almost as an afterthought, he asked when I'd graduated college. I told him. There was a pause, barely noticeable if you weren't watching for it, and then a slight shift in his tone for the rest of the call. A little more formal, a little more careful, like he was already writing the rejection email in his head. I got that rejection 3 days later. We've decided to move forward with a candidate whose experience more closely aligns with our current needs. I'd had more relevant experience than anyone else in that room, and we both knew it. I started applying to jobs below my level, just to get a foot in the door somewhere, anywhere. Help desk positions I could have done blindfolded 15 years earlier. Even those didn't call back. I remember thinking, with a kind of bitter humor, that I'd somehow become both overqualified and invisible at the exact same time. My savings drained faster than any spreadsheet I'd built at work had predicted. The math had seemed so simple when I first got laid off. Mortgage, utilities, groceries, insurance, minus severance, minus unemployment, equals some number of months before things got tight. I hadn't accounted for how much slower the job search would be, or how quickly small expenses add up when there's no income refilling the account. I sold the truck first. A 2-year-old F-15, I'd been proud of. Traded for a much older sedan and enough cash to cover 4 more months of the mortgage. I stopped meeting friends for dinner, partly out of pride, partly because I genuinely couldn't justify $40 on a meal I could make at home for 6. A few guys from the old office reached out here and there, asking how the search was going. I got good at saying, getting some bites, staying optimistic. Even when the truth was closer to, I applied to a warehouse logistics job yesterday and didn't hear back. There's a specific kind of loneliness that comes from being unemployed at 49, with no one at home to share the weight of it. When you're younger, there's a sense that everyone's in the same boat. Friends job hopping, comparing notes, commiserating over drinks. At my age, most of my peers were settled, secure, climbing steadily toward retirement. I wasn't complaining to anyone about my situation because nobody around me was living anything close to it. Some nights I sat in that quiet house, the same house that had echoed since the divorce, now echoing with a different kind of absence, and asked myself what exactly I had worked so hard for all those years, if it could vanish this fast. 25 years of showing up early, staying late, solving other people's problems. And in 8 months, none of it seemed to matter to anyone hiring. I started skipping small things I used to take for granted. I canceled a streaming subscription. I stopped getting haircuts at my usual place and started doing it myself, badly, in the bathroom mirror. I remember standing in the grocery store one afternoon, doing quiet math in my head over whether I could afford the brand name coffee or needed to switch to the generic can, and feeling a wave of shame so specific it almost knocked the wind out of me. 25 years of a 6-figure salary, and I was standing in a grocery aisle counting dollars over coffee. The house itself became a kind of enemy. Every room reminded me of a version of my life that no longer existed. The office upstairs where I used to log in remotely on weekends, now dark and unused. The garage where the truck used to sit. The kitchen table, still the one from the marriage, where I now ate alone most nights, scrolling job boards on my phone between bites. It was my old college roommate Dave Whitfield who first mentioned the Philippines, almost as a joke, in a phone call that was supposed to just be him checking in on me. "You know what you should do," he said, half laughing. "Sell everything, move to Cebu. I'm serious. I've been out here 2 years. My money goes 4 times as far." Dave had married a Filipina woman named Liza he'd met years earlier, and they'd relocated together after he retired early from a mid-level corporate job that, frankly, hadn't paid much better than mine. I laughed it off at first, the way you laugh off any idea that sounds too different from your normal life to take seriously. Sell my house? Move to a country I'd only ever seen on a map? At 49, alone, with no language skills, no connections, nothing but a suitcase and whatever was left in my bank account? But I couldn't stop thinking about it. That's the strange thing about desperation. It makes you actually consider things your old, comfortable self would have dismissed instantly. I started researching late at night, the way some people scroll social media to numb out. Except my numbing agent became cost of living calculators, expat forums, Facebook groups for Americans living in the Philippines, YouTube videos of guys my age walking through markets in Cebu and Dumaguete, talking about paying $200 a month for an apartment with an ocean view. The numbers didn't just look better. They looked like a different life was mathematically possible. A life where my remaining savings, instead of running out in 8 months, might stretch to 2 or 3 years. A life where I wasn't measuring my worth against a job market that had already quietly decided I was invisible. I spent almost 3 weeks in this quiet research phase, telling no one except Dave what I was actually considering. I'd stay up until 2 a.m. reading forum threads from other men my age, some hopeful, some bitter, a handful genuinely angry at what they felt life in America had become for someone without a young family or a 6-figure job still intact. I read about health insurance options for expats, about the retirement visa program, about which cities had the best infrastructure for someone starting mostly from scratch. Slowly, the idea stopped feeling like a joke and started feeling like a plan. I won't pretend the decision was easy or quick. I second-guessed myself constantly, some days convinced this was the smartest move of my life, other days certain I was one bad decision away from becoming a cautionary tale my old coworkers would whisper about at happy hour. Was I running away from my problems, or was I finally facing them honestly? That question kept me up more nights than I'd like to admit. Everything in American culture tells you that the answer to failure is to try harder, stay the course, double down where you are. Moving to another country felt, to some part of me, like giving up, like admitting defeat. But another part of me, a quieter, more honest part, knew the truth. Staying in Dallas wasn't trying harder. It was slowly bleeding out savings while hoping a market that had already rejected me 200 times would suddenly change its mind. There's a difference between persistence and denial, and I was starting to understand which one I'd been practicing. I talked to Dave on video calls for weeks. He was patient with my endless questions: visa requirements, health care, safety, What happens if I hate it and want to come back? What a normal week actually looked like for him. I read horror stories from expat forums, guys who got scammed, guys who got lonely, guys who moved back within 6 months poorer and more disillusioned than before. I also read the other stories, men and women my age who described feeling, for the first time in years, like they had room to breathe again. I made a list of every fear I had, written out longhand on a legal pad, old habit from years of decision matrices at work. What if I get sick and can't access good health care? What if I run out of money anyway? What if I hate it and have already burned the bridge of my old life to get there? What if, at 49, I'm simply too set in my ways to adapt to somewhere so different? Next to each fear, I wrote down what I actually knew, not what I feared. Healthcare in the Philippines' major cities, I'd learned, was more affordable and, in many private hospitals, comparable in quality to the US, especially for a fraction of the cost. My money, even conservatively estimated, would last 3 to 4 times longer there than in Dallas. If I hated it, I still had a plane ticket back, even if pride made that option feel unbearable to imagine. And as for being too set in my ways, well, I was about to find out, one way or the other. Eventually, I sat down one evening with that same legal pad and did the math one more time. Column 1, staying in Dallas, an empty house, a mortgage I could barely justify for one person, a job market that had already made its verdict clear. Column 2, the Philippines, lower cost of living, a fresh start. Uncertainty, yes, but a different kind of uncertainty. One I'd be choosing instead of one being done to me. What did I actually have left to lose in Dallas? An empty house and a silence that had already been going on far longer than 8 months. Once I made the decision, I moved faster than I expected. I listed the house with a realtor who'd sold 2 other homes on my street and had a track record of quick closings. I remember standing in my empty living room the week before closing, looking at the faded rectangle on the wall where a family photo used to hang, long since taken down after the divorce, and feeling something I hadn't expected: relief. I sold most of the furniture through a local marketplace app. The leather couch I'd bought thinking it would last me the rest of my life. The dining table that had sat unused for years because I ate standing at the kitchen counter more often than not. I kept a small storage unit with a handful of things I couldn't bring myself to part with. Some photos, my father's old toolbox, a box of documents. There was a strange grief to the process, even though I was the one choosing it. Every item that left the house felt like closing a door on a version of my life I'd once been proud of. The dining table had hosted Thanksgivings, back when my marriage was still intact and my ex-wife's family would come into town. Selling it to a stranger for $80 felt smaller than it should have, given everything it had once represented. But there was also, underneath the grief, a growing sense of lightness. Each box I packed, each piece of furniture I sold, felt like shedding weight I hadn't realized I was still carrying. By the time the house closed, I had exactly 2 suitcases and a carry-on bag. That's what 25 years and a house came down to, in the end. 2 suitcases and a one-way ticket to Cebu. The first weeks were disorienting in ways I hadn't fully prepared for, even with all my research. The heat hit differently than I expected. Not just hot, but humid in a way that made my clothes stick within minutes of stepping outside. The traffic in Cebu City moved in a rhythm that seemed to have no rules I could recognize. Jeepneys and motorbikes weaving through gaps that looked physically impossible. The language, mostly Cebuano mixed with English, meant I could understand fragments of conversations, but not whole sentences. Dave met me at the airport, and I remember the relief of seeing a familiar face after 20 hours of travel and a lifetime of decisions leading up to that moment. He'd arranged for me to stay in his guest room for the first 2 weeks while I got my bearings, an offer I was grateful for in a way I hadn't expected to need so badly. Those first days blurred together, jet lag, sensory overload, the strange feeling of being simultaneously anonymous and hyper-visible as one of relatively few Western faces in most of the neighborhoods I walked through. I made small, embarrassing mistakes constantly. I didn't understand the informal rules of jeepney fares. I overtipped at a local restaurant by an amount that made the server laugh kindly and try to hand some of it back. I got lost twice in my first week, trying to walk somewhere Dave had described as just a 5-minute walk, which turned out to mean 5 minutes if you already knew which unmarked alley to turn down. But something else happened too. something I hadn't fully expected despite all the videos I'd watched. People smiled at me on the street for no clear reason. Neighbors in the small building where I rented my first apartment introduced themselves without being asked twice, invited me to a small gathering within my second week there, something that would have taken months if it ever happened at all. Back in my old Dallas neighborhood where I'd lived for over a decade without learning most of my neighbors' last names. I rented a modest one-bedroom condo with a partial ocean view for less than a third of what my old mortgage payment had been. For the first time in over a year, I did the math and found myself with room left over at the end of the month instead of less than nothing. It took me almost 2 months to notice something had shifted in how I felt physically. Back in Dallas, during the job search, I'd carried a constant low hum of tension in my shoulders, a tightness that never fully went away even when I tried to relax. I hadn't realized how normal that tension had become until it started to lift. Part of it was the pace of life. Part of it was simply not checking my email 15 times a day, refreshing job boards like a compulsion, waiting for rejections that had started to feel personal, even though I knew, logically, they weren't. Part of it, too, was distance. Literal distance from the house that it echoed, from the office parking lot where I'd sat numb after Denise's phone call, from an entire life built around an identity that had been taken from me in a 15-minute meeting. I started sleeping better. I started eating meals slowly, sometimes at a small cafe near my building, where the owner, a woman named Rosalie, began remembering my order by my second week. Something as small as that meant more to me than I expected, given how invisible I'd felt for the better part of a year. I also noticed, for the first time in longer than I could remember, that I wasn't constantly comparing myself to some imagined version of a man who'd never gotten laid off, never gotten divorced, never had to think twice about buying name-brand coffee. That comparison had been running quietly in the background of my mind for over a year, and its absence felt like turning off a machine I hadn't realized was always humming. Slowly, I built a routine again, though it looked nothing like my old one. Mornings started at Rosalie's cafe, coffee and a simple breakfast, sometimes reading, sometimes just watching the street. In the afternoons, I started volunteering, almost by accident, teaching basic computer skills to teenagers in the neighborhood through a small community program Dave had mentioned to me. It wasn't my old career. It wasn't a return to managing enterprise systems or leading a team of engineers. It was smaller, quieter work. But it filled something the job search never had, even in the months it was technically going well. I remember one teenager, a boy named Jericho, maybe 15, who'd never used a spreadsheet before and picked it up faster than most of the junior hires I used to train back in Dallas. Watching him understand something, seeing that small flash of confidence cross his face, reminded me of exactly why I used to love mentoring people at the office before the emails turned cold and the calls stopped coming. I made a small circle of friends, too. Other expats, a few Filipino neighbors who had invited me into their lives with a generosity I genuinely hadn't expected. There was Tom, a retired firefighter from Oregon who'd been in Cebu for 6 years and had a dry sense of humor that reminded me of my father. There was a Filipino couple next door, Ramon and Grace, who insisted I come to every birthday party in the building, whether I knew the person turning a year older or not. I also, cautiously and without fully planning it, started picking up small freelance IT consulting jobs for local businesses, a family-run hardware store that needed help, setting up a basic inventory system, a small tour operator whose website hadn't been updated in years. The pay was modest by Dallas standards, but it didn't need to stretch as far here, and more than the money, it gave me back a version of the feeling I'd lost the day Denise called, the feeling of being useful, of having something specific to offer that someone else genuinely needed. I'd be lying if I said every day was easy. There were nights, especially in the first few months, when the loneliness crept back in, a different flavor of loneliness than Dallas, but loneliness all the same, missing familiar things, missing English spoken the way I was used to hearing it, missing, oddly enough, some small conveniences I'd taken for granted my whole life, like knowing exactly which aisle held what I needed at the grocery store. There were also moments of doubt about the decision itself. A minor scam attempt during my first month, when a man at a market tried to overcharge me for a phone case, assuming I wouldn't know the going rate. Nothing dangerous, just enough to remind me I was and would remain an outsider in some ways, no matter how long I stayed. A bout of food poisoning that had me questioning everything for about 72 hours. A homesick week around what would have been my mother's birthday. Spent scrolling old family photos on my laptop, wondering if I'd made a terrible, irreversible mistake. But each time doubt surfaced, I forced myself to ask the same honest question I'd asked myself back in Dallas with that legal pad. Compared to what? Compared to sitting in an empty house, refreshing job boards, watching savings drain towards zero, while a market that had already rejected me 200 times continued to reject me. The doubts never survived that comparison for long. It's been just over a year since I stepped off that plane in Cebu with 2 suitcases and more uncertainty than confidence. My savings, instead of the emergency fund I was terrified of exhausting, has actually grown slightly thanks to the lower cost of living and some freelance IT consulting work I picked up for a handful of small local businesses who needed help modernizing outdated systems. Work I never would have found back home, where nobody wanted to hire a 49-year-old for anything beyond a stopgap contract. I still teach at the community program twice a week. Jericho is now helping his older cousin build a small online store, something he never would have imagined a year ago. Rosalie still remembers my order, though now it's less about being remembered and more about being known. A small but real difference. I think about Dallas sometimes, not with bitterness anymore, but with a kind of clarity I couldn't have had while I was still there. That life wasn't wrong. It gave me 25 years of purpose, a career I was genuinely good at, and lessons about discipline and work ethic I still carry with me. But it also had an ending, whether I wanted it to or not. And for a long time, I mistook the ending of that chapter for the ending of my whole story. If you're 49, or 55, or 61, and you've just been told your job doesn't need you anymore, I want you to know something I wish someone had told me during those 8 silent months in Dallas. The rejection you're facing isn't a verdict on your worth. It's a verdict on a system that has decided, unfairly and often quietly, that people our age are harder to place. That's a truth about the market, not about you. I also want you to know that starting over doesn't have to mean starting from nothing. I didn't lose my 25 years of experience when I got on that plane. I brought them with me, and they became useful again. Just in a different shape, in a different place, on different terms than the ones I'd been fighting so hard to hold on to. Aging with dignity, I've come to believe, isn't about clinging to the life you built before everything changed. It's about being willing to build something new when the old structure can no longer hold you, and trusting that you still have enough left in you to do it. I didn't know that at 49, sitting in my driveway after Denise's phone call. I know it now. And if there's one thing I'd say to anyone standing where I once stood, job gone, savings shrinking, feeling invisible to a market that used to want you, it's this. The ending of one chapter doesn't have to mean the ending of the book. Sometimes it just means the story is about to take you somewhere you never expected to look.